You know what's fascinating? Society has convinced us that being single means being incomplete, but research shows people in healthy relationships and content single people have nearly identical happiness levels.
Well, that's such an interesting perspective, especially since we're bombarded with messages about finding the one from such an early age.
And here's what really gets me. Studies show that this relationship obsession actually creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more desperately someone seeks a relationship, the less likely they are to form a healthy one.
That reminds me of the fascinating psychological concept of attachment theory, how our earliest relationships with parents shape our adult relationship patterns.
Oh, you're absolutely right about that connection. Research indicates that roughly 56% of people end up choosing romantic partners who mirror their most challenging parental relationship.
Well, that's a startling statistic. Why do you think we're drawn to recreating these complicated dynamics?
The psychology behind it suggests it's our unconscious attempt to heal old wounds. Think about it. If we had a distant father, we might seek out emotionally unavailable partners, hoping to finally win that elusive approval.
So, in essence, we're trying to rewrite our childhood stories through our adult relationships.
Precisely. And here's where it gets really interesting. Studies in neuroplasticity show that we can actually rewire these patterns, but it requires something most people aren't willing to do: spend time alone.
That brings up something important about the modern dating landscape, how dating apps have turned finding love into almost a consumer experience.
Recent data shows the average person spends 5.2 hours per week on dating apps, yet satisfaction rates with online dating have dropped by 23% in the last 5 years.
Well, that certainly challenges the notion that more options lead to better outcomes.
And speaking of challenging notions, let's talk about this concept of dating celibacy that's gaining traction. It's not about swearing off relationships forever. It's about intentionally creating space for self-discovery.
The timing of this conversation feels particularly relevant, given that studies show millennials are getting married later than any previous generation.
That's right. The average age of first marriage has increased by almost 7 years since 1970. But here's what's fascinating. Research shows those who marry later actually report higher levels of marital satisfaction.
That seems to support the idea that taking time to develop individually leads to stronger partnerships.
Exactly, and neuroscience backs this up. When we spend time in solitude, we actually strengthen the neural pathways associated with self-awareness and emotional regulation.
That's fascinating. How long does it typically take to see meaningful changes in these patterns?
Research suggests a minimum of 3 months of intentional solo time can create significant shifts in relationship patterns. But here's the key. It's not just about being alone, it's about active self-development.
Well, that makes me think about how different cultures approach this whole concept of relationships and self-development.
Oh, that's such an important point. In many Eastern traditions, there's actually a prescribed period of self-discovery before marriage. For instance, in certain Buddhist practices, it's recommended to spend at least a year in self-reflection before making major relationship commitments.
That's quite different from our Western happily ever after narrative.
And here's what's really interesting about that. Psychological studies show that cultures with these built-in periods of self-discovery report lower divorce rates and higher relationship satisfaction overall.
So, what would you say are the practical steps someone could take to break free from this relationship trap?
Well, research points to 3 key practices. First, developing a robust self-care routine. Studies show people who maintain strong individual interests are 43% more likely to report relationship satisfaction. Second, building a diverse support network. Having at least 5 close friendships correlates with higher life satisfaction regardless of relationship status. And third, engaging in regular mindfulness practices.
That reminds me of the concept of kingdom building you mentioned earlier. Can you elaborate on how that fits into this framework?
Think of it this way, Sui. When we shift our focus from finding a relationship to building something meaningful, everything changes. Studies show that people who are actively engaged in community service or personal projects report feeling more fulfilled, whether they're in a relationship or not.
Well, that certainly challenges the conventional wisdom about relationships being the key to happiness.
And here's what's really powerful. Again, research from positive psychology shows that people who focus on personal growth and community contribution actually become more attractive partners naturally without trying to be.
That seems to create a beautiful paradox. The less we chase relationships, the more likely we are to form healthy ones.
Exactly, and the data supports this. A recent study showed that people who rated high on self-actualization scales were 67% more likely to form lasting, satisfying relationships. But interestingly, they were also perfectly content being single.
So what would you say to someone listening who's feeling stuck in this relationship trap right now?
Well, the research suggests starting with a 90-day relationship sabbatical. During this time, focus on 3 things: developing a new skill or hobby, deepening existing friendships, and establishing a daily mindfulness practice. Studies show this combination creates the optimal conditions for personal growth.
That's such practical advice. And it seems like it would build resilience regardless of relationship status.
Absolutely, and here's the really exciting part. Neuroscience shows that when we focus on personal growth, we actually become more capable of forming deeper connections with others. It's like we're upgrading our relationship operating system.
Well, that's a powerful way to look at it. Investing in ourselves first actually enables us to build better relationships later.
And that might be the key to breaking free from the relationship trap altogether. Recognizing that our completeness isn't determined by our relationship status, but by our relationship with ourselves.